My name is Vivian. I'm 60 years old, and I've been married to Paul for 34 years. When you've been with someone that long, you start to feel like your lives are intertwined in a way that goes beyond just a marriage. You become part of their story, and they become part of yours. The problem is, after all those years, I'd started to realize that I had become nothing more than a footnote in his. I've always been the supportive wife, the one who keeps everything running behind the scenes. Paul is the public figure, the face of the district, as they like to call him. He's a businessman, a philanthropist, a giver. He donates to schools, helps build parks, funds the local fireworks show for the 4th of July every year. The town loves him. He's everywhere, at charity galas, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and always in front of the cameras with that smile of his. I don't mind, not at first. That's what he does. He works hard for his community. He builds his reputation one gesture at a time. But what no one knew, what no one ever saw, was the woman who stood behind him through all of it. The woman who kept the house clean, who cooked his meals, who made sure his suits were pressed and his life was in order. The woman who laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, who stood beside him at every public event, and who silently watched as he basked in the adoration of a crowd that had no idea who I really was. For years, I didn't mind. I loved him. Or at least, I thought I did. I had always believed that the world needed people like Paul. His work mattered. His name mattered. So I put my own needs aside. He was the one out there, doing all the things that mattered. I was just his partner in all of it. In the background, quietly ensuring everything ran smoothly. But the thing about staying in the background for too long is that you start to forget who you really are. You forget that you're not just a sidekick. You forget that you were once someone who had dreams, who had a voice, who mattered. I never complained, never made a fuss. It was our way of life. I was content with the way things were, or so I told myself. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but then as time wore on, I started noticing the cracks. They weren't in our home or in our marriage, at least not outwardly. No, they were in Paul, in the way he acted, the way he began to look at his audience more than his family. He began to love the applause more than the quiet moments at home with me. And like any woman who has been married for as long as I have, I started to feel the shift. There's a moment, when you realize things aren't the way they used to be. It's not some grand dramatic moment, no, it's subtle. You start to notice the little things. How he doesn't seem to be as interested in your day anymore. How he doesn't ask about your feelings as much as he used to. You start to realize that the laughter he used to share with you is now directed at strangers who will never know the real him. That's when I started feeling it. The loneliness. It wasn't something I could put into words at first. It was just there, like a shadow in our home, always lingering but never acknowledged. I think, deep down, I always knew something was wrong, but I convinced myself I was being dramatic, or that it was just a phase. After all, this was Paul, the man who loved me, the man who built our lives together. But then, one night, everything changed. It was late when I saw it. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Paul had been working late again, as usual. He was always on the phone, always typing away on his laptop. I had gotten used to the sound of his calls, the hushed conversations, the steady rhythm of his fingers against the keyboard, the way his voice would shift when he was discussing business with someone important. But tonight, something felt different. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard him walk into the living room. He tossed his jacket on the couch and plopped down, his feet kicking off his shoes as he opened his phone. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a typical night. I was just about to start the dishes when I noticed him through the open door, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. I hadn't meant to peek. Honestly, I hadn't. But it's hard to ignore someone's phone when it's right there in front of you, buzzing with notifications. As I washed the dishes, my eyes drifted over to him. He was sitting there, his thumb scrolling through his messages. His face was soft, a smile tugging at his lips, a look I hadn't seen in a long time. Then the message appeared on the screen, clear as day, bright against the dark background. "Can't wait to see you sparkle on the 4th, babe." I froze. It wasn't for me. It wasn't even a message from a business partner or a friend. It was a message from someone who wasn't me, someone who had called him babe. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into me. I should have looked away. I should have walked out of the room, gone back to my work, ignored what I had just seen. But I didn't. I couldn't. The message burned itself into my mind, leaving a trail of questions, of confusion, of betrayal. "Who is this?" I whispered to myself, as if the phone could answer. I didn't confront him right away. No, I wasn't that impulsive. I needed to think, to process. But something in me shifted, like a switch had been flipped. That quiet ache I had been carrying for years suddenly became a scream in my chest. It wasn't just a flirtation, a casual affair. This was real. He had someone else, someone who got the affection I had been waiting for, someone who was getting his time, his attention, his love. But the most infuriating part? He was still the man everyone else saw, the man they thought of as their hero, their charitable benefactor, their model citizen. He was the man who had made the 4th of July celebration a town-wide tradition, the man who poured money into the fireworks display, who arranged for music, food trucks, and the whole spectacle. He was the man they raised glasses to, the man they toasted to, and I had been standing beside him, smiling, playing the part of the perfect wife. But tonight, it became painfully clear. I had become nothing more than background noise in his life. I stood there for a moment, the dish towel clutched tightly in my hand, the sound of the message still echoing in my mind. He hadn't even noticed that I was standing there, that I had seen what I had seen. To him, this was nothing. It was just another message. But to me, it was everything. It was the final piece of the puzzle I had been slowly putting together over the years, the piece that confirmed what I had suspected all along. He had no respect for me anymore, no real love, no real connection. But if he thought I was going to let this go, he was wrong. The days leading up to the 4th of July were a blur. I watched as Paul became more and more consumed by the celebration preparations. He was busy with meetings, phone calls, and organizing every little detail for the district's annual event. He was thrilled, of course. This was his time to shine, his time to be the center of attention. But for me, it was a different kind of waiting. I knew that something had to change. I couldn't go on like this anymore, hiding behind the smile, playing the part of the dutiful wife. I started to watch him differently. I paid attention to his little habits, his interactions, the way he spoke when he was with others versus when he was with me. I noticed how he never bothered to share his schedule anymore, how he was always out, meeting with business associates, while I stayed home, alone in the house that used to be our home. How, when I asked questions about his day, he would give vague answers, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't just the affair I had uncovered, it was the years of lies, of neglect, the realization that I had been living with a man who saw me as nothing more than a piece of furniture in his perfectly curated life. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I also felt something else: clarity. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to confront him directly. No, That would give him the chance to turn things around, to apologize, to explain himself. I wasn't interested in hearing any of that. I had already spent too many years listening to excuses and pretending to believe them. So I decided to expose him, but not in the way he might expect. I spent the next few days working in silence. When he wasn't around, I went through his things. I searched his desk, his drawers, his phone. It wasn't hard. I had access to everything. I knew how he operated. I found receipts, messages, and photos that confirmed everything I had suspected. There were hotel bills, texts with different women, and images that spoke volumes. But the most telling part was the pattern. The way he had compartmentalized his life, keeping his public persona separate from his private one. He thought he could keep them apart, that the facade of a happy marriage would remain intact while he played the field behind the scenes. He thought he could control the narrative. I wasn't going to let him. I spent hours putting everything together. I didn't need words. The facts spoke for themselves. I didn't want to create a story. I just wanted to show the truth. So I gathered the pictures, the messages, the receipts, and laid them out in a way that told the story without saying a word. I compiled everything into a video. No narration, no sound, just images flashing across the screen, flags, fireworks, and the cold, hard evidence of his betrayal. The final touch was simple, a title screen that read, "Happy Independence Day from all your women." I smirked as I typed the words. It was almost too perfect. I saved the video to a USB stick and carefully labeled it, "Final Draft." The irony of it hit me hard. This was my script, my story, and it was time for Paul to play the role I had written for him. The night before the 4th, Paul was busy finalizing last-minute details for the event. He was at the office making phone calls, checking on the fireworks, and coordinating with the vendors. As usual, he was consumed by the event, by the idea of being the center of attention. He didn't even notice I was slowly slipping away from him, that I was already planning my own performance for the next day. When he came home, exhausted and eager to sleep, I pretended everything was normal. I smiled and asked him about the event, about the guests, about the fireworks. He smiled back, eager to talk about all the things he loved, but his eyes were glazed over, distracted. I didn't care anymore. He wasn't the man I thought he was. The man I had spent decades loving and supporting had disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized. But tomorrow, he would feel the weight of what he had done. The 4th of July arrived in a swirl of sound and color, just as it always did. Paul was up at the crack of dawn, running through his checklist, overseeing the final preparations for the district's celebration. The air was thick with the scent of grilled food and fresh-cut grass, a typical summer morning. The whole town seemed to be buzzing, excited for the fireworks show that Paul had worked so hard to make happen. This was his day, his moment to shine. I could feel the tension building in my chest, but I kept it hidden. I had my role to play, just like I always did. The dutiful wife, the smiling support. I wore my best smile, my Wife of the Year mask, as I helped with the final touches. I stood beside him as we greeted the first few guests, shaking hands and making small talk. The crowd was arriving, families, friends, donors. They all knew Paul, knew the persona he had cultivated. They adored him. He was their hero. And for a moment, I almost hated them for it. Paul was in his element. He grabbed the microphone, his voice booming through the loudspeakers as he welcomed everyone. "Welcome, friends. We're here to celebrate the 4th of July, our freedom, and what makes this community great." His voice was full of energy, confident, proud. The crowd cheered. The applause was deafening. But I stood there, silent, watching him, knowing what he had done. The lies, the deceit, the hidden life. It felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on me as I watched him bask in the adoration of people who had no idea who he really was. It was time. I glanced around, spotting the technician who was setting up the screen. I had arranged everything in advance, told him when to expect the flash drive, what time it needed to go live. He gave me a small nod as he plugged the USB stick into the system, ready to play the video. He didn't know what was coming, but he trusted me, and in that moment I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't about the crowd or Paul or even the grand spectacle. This was about me, my freedom, my release from all the years of silence, of pretending. It was about exposing the truth, not just to Paul, but to everyone who had built him up, who had ignored the truth for so long. I stood off to the side, keeping my distance. I could hear the sound of laughter, the chatter of people gathering, the distant hum of music. The air was thick with anticipation as the fireworks display was about to begin. Paul's speech was winding down, the crowd eagerly awaiting the grand finale. "Let's raise a glass to freedom, to truth, to family," he called out, lifting his glass. The crowd cheered again, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. He was still their hero, their leader. I watched as he turned to the crowd, waiting for the applause. That was when I made my move. I walked over to the technician, who had been keeping his eyes on the screen, ready for the show to start. I passed him the flash drive. "This is the latest version of the presentation," I whispered, a tight smile tugging at my lips. He nodded, not knowing what was coming. Then I stepped back, retreating into the shadows. The music shifted, becoming more dramatic, the crowd settling into a hushed anticipation. Paul turned back to the microphone, ready for the grand reveal of the fireworks. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't just a fireworks show. It was a fireworks display of his own life, of his lies, of his secret world. The screen flickered to life, and the crowd grew quiet. The first image flashed across the screen, a photo of Paul with one of his mistresses, taken in a hotel room. The crowd gasped, but they didn't know who it was. They didn't know it was him. Then came another picture, a different woman, this time in a park, smiling up at him. They were holding hands. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what they were looking at. The next photo, a close-up of him kissing yet another woman, this time taken in broad daylight. The time and date stamped on the photo were clear. The images kept coming, each one a cruel revelation. The places, the dates, the women. It was all there, displayed for everyone to see. The faces in the crowd began to change. People were whispering, pointing, looking at each other, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some were filming on their phones, others just stared in shock. But the most telling part was Paul. His smile faltered, his hand shaking as he held the microphone. His face turned pale, the color draining from it as he slowly turned to the screen. He saw it. He saw the destruction of everything he had worked so hard to build. He wasn't a hero anymore. He wasn't the charming businessman or the philanthropist. He was a joke, a meme, and I watched it happen. The music didn't stop. The video continued, the last image flashing across the screen. A simple message written in bold letters. "Happy Independence Day from all your women." The crowd was silent. The laughter had stopped. Paul was standing there, frozen, his mouth open, his eyes wide with disbelief. His public image, his carefully crafted persona, had been torn to shreds. All his secrets laid bare for everyone to see. I didn't wait to see the fallout. I didn't need to. I turned and walked away, stepping into the cool night air, my footsteps steady and calm. The world around me was already shifting, already changing. His empire was crumbling, and I had played my part in it. I didn't stick around to watch the wreckage unfold. I knew what would happen next. The silence in the crowd would turn to whispers, then to hushed murmurs. Faces would fall, expressions would shift from confusion to realization. The phones would be out, recording, capturing the downfall of a man who had spent his life perfecting the image of an upstanding community leader. And just like that, the curtain would fall. The chaos would take care of itself. I drove home in the quiet, the weight of the evening slowly sinking in. The streets of the town were eerily still, and as I passed the various locations where Paul had built his empire, it felt almost surreal. This was his world, the businesses he had started, the schools he had funded, the community events he had sponsored. None of it mattered now. By the time I reached the house, I was already feeling the shift. There would be no more pretending, no more smiling through it all, no more carrying the weight of his secrets, no more standing behind him, waiting for his approval. I didn't feel any triumph, not yet, not in the way I thought I would. I went inside, changed into something comfortable, and poured myself a glass of wine. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists when everything is about to change. The phone rang just as I sat down. It was the only call I expected that night. My lawyer. "Vivian," he said, his voice grim. "You did it, didn't you?" I took a sip of my wine, letting the tension in my shoulders ease. "Yes," I said simply, my voice steady. "I did." There was a pause. I could hear the sound of papers shuffling on the other end, and then his voice again, more composed now. "What's done is done, but you need to know, his foundation's been frozen, sponsors are pulling out, the press is already on it, the phones are blowing up. You're going to see a lot of articles tomorrow." "Good," I replied, though I felt nothing like victory in that word. Let them write what they want. It's too late for him to fix anything now. I could hear him hesitate, unsure whether to say more. "Vivian, he's not going to go down quietly. You know that, right?" I sighed. Of course, I knew. He was a man who never admitted defeat. But that was his problem now, not mine. I didn't need to worry about the fallout. He had built his empire on lies, and I had taken it down with the truth. That was all I needed to do. "I'm not worried about him," I said, hanging up the phone. The next few hours were a blur. I wasn't there when the reporters came or when the first social media posts started circulating. I wasn't there when the first calls for his resignation came in or when the sponsors began to pull their funding. I didn't need to be. I was already free. The following days were like a storm had swept through town. The articles began to flood in, each one more damning than the last. His past was laid bare for everyone to see. The lies, the infidelity, the carefully concealed affairs, the photos, the messages, it was all there, and there was no denying it anymore. Paul's world began to crumble. It was a slow process, but inevitable. The foundation he had built so carefully, with so many hands reaching out to him, all started to unravel. He was no longer the face of the district. He was the punchline of a joke that no one could forget. But it wasn't just his public life that was falling apart. The whispers in the community began to grow louder, the rumors more widespread. His friends, his allies, the people who had once supported him, they turned their backs. They didn't want to be associated with someone who had been exposed in such a way. Even the few who had tried to defend him at first began to distance themselves, not wanting to be caught up in the fallout. I watched it all from a distance, detached, as though I was observing a story I had no part in. But I had played my part, and I was content with that. It wasn't until 3 days after the scandal that I heard from Paul. It was late at night when my phone rang. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. "Vivian?" His voice crackled on the other end, tired, defeated. You've done it. You've ruined me. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, but I couldn't bring myself to care about anything outside of this moment. You did that yourself, I said, my voice as cold as ice. I only revealed what you've been hiding. For years. You? He started, but the words seemed to get caught in his throat. How could you do this to me, to us, after everything I've done for you, for this family? I cut him off. You did nothing for me, Paul. You did it for you, for your image, for your ego, and I was just there to make sure no one noticed the cracks. There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear him trying to figure out how to salvage whatever was left of his pride. But he wouldn't. I'm leaving, I added, my words final, no hint of hesitation. You can figure it out on your own. There was no response, just the sound of him breathing heavily, before the line went dead. I didn't waste another moment. I packed a bag, grabbed my things, and left the house. I didn't feel a bit of regret. I didn't feel guilt or shame. I felt lighter than I had in years. I checked into a hotel overlooking the water, the same one I'd always wanted to stay in, but never had the chance. I ordered a slice of pie, sipped my wine, and let the reality of the last few days settle in. Paul's empire was crumbling. The people who had once adored him were turning on him, and he was left with nothing, not even his image. And as I sat there, I realized something. I had done exactly what I set out to do. I had watched his world burn, and I was free. I could breathe again. It was a strange, liberating feeling. The phone calls stopped. The texts ceased. I didn't need to check the news anymore. It was over. Paul was over. I didn't need to look back. A year later, on the 4th of July, I lit a candle on my balcony, watching as the sky filled with fireworks in the distance. But I wasn't part of the crowd. I didn't need to be. Just me, a cup of tea, and a line in my diary. Freedom is when you no longer listen to toasts. You just live. And for the first time in years, I truly did. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines, interviews, and public commentary. For the first time in years, I had the space to breathe without worrying about his image, his needs, or his lies. Paul was no longer the centerpiece of my life, and without him, I began to realize just how much of myself I had been sacrificing all these years. The phone didn't ring much after that, at least not with the frantic calls from Paul begging for forgiveness. The press had moved on to other scandals, other high-profile betrayals. But the echoes of the fall from grace reverberated throughout the community, a community that had once worshipped him. I didn't take satisfaction in their collective outrage. I was too busy with my own rebuilding process, too busy reclaiming pieces of myself that had been hidden in the shadows of his ambitions for decades. It wasn't long before I noticed the shift. The ripple effect had spread wider than I had anticipated. I walked through the grocery store one afternoon, picking up a few things for dinner, when I overheard a conversation near the bread aisle. Two women were talking in hushed tones, but I caught enough to know they were discussing Paul. One of them was mocking his recent downfall, while the other seemed almost sympathetic, a hint of guilt in her voice. I don't know, the sympathetic one said. He was always so nice, so involved with the community. But, well, I guess it was all a show, wasn't it? The other woman scoffed. A show? Please. We all knew something was off. Vivian was always too quiet. You could tell she was just there, like she didn't matter. I froze for a moment, gripping the handle of the shopping cart. I wasn't sure if I was more angry at the assumption that I had been passive for all those years, or at the fact that no one ever noticed my own sacrifices until now. But there was a certain sting to it, the realization that I had been invisible in his world, even to those who claimed to be close. As I walked away, I realized something important. This wasn't about their perceptions of me. It wasn't about whether or not they felt sorry for me. It was about me reclaiming my life, not for them, but for myself. I kept the hotel for a few more weeks, just to give myself time to adjust. I didn't want to rush back into the life I'd once known, especially with all the changes I had been through. When I finally returned to the house, it was a strange experience. It felt like someone else's life. There were too many memories, too many moments where I had smiled and played my part in his perfect little world. The home was filled with reminders of who I used to be, but that person no longer existed. I put my personal items in storage, took a few boxes of things I could use, and packed my car. The house no longer felt like home. As for Paul, he disappeared from my life just as quickly as he had entered it. After the public fallout, his influence waned, and the business he had worked so hard to build crumbled. No amount of press conferences or apologies could undo what I had exposed. In the end, it was the loss of his image that devastated him the most. His reputation had been his whole identity, and without it, he was nothing. There were no legal battles, no drawn-out fights over property or money. That wasn't necessary. Paul had already lost the one thing that mattered, his public persona. The damage was done, and no lawyer, no media strategy could fix it. A few months passed before I received a letter from him, postmarked from a small town in another state. I didn't open it right away. For a long time, I kept it on my kitchen counter, staring at it every time I passed by. The thought of what was inside haunted me, but I had no intention of letting his words affect me again. Finally, one night, I decided to open it. It was a short letter written in his familiar, scrawling handwriting. I read the first few lines. "Vivian, I never meant for any of this to happen. You know that, right? I know I made mistakes, but please, I never meant for you to be part of this. I thought I was protecting you. I thought that what I did was for the good of the family, for the good of our image. I never realized how much I hurt you. You were always there for me. I was selfish, and I am sorry." The rest of the letter was filled with excuses, pleading, and promises to change. But I wasn't interested in any of it. I folded the letter neatly and put it in the trash. There was no part of me that wanted him back, no part of me that needed his apologies or his guilt. I had already moved on. The man who had once been everything to me was no longer in my life, and I was free. The anniversary of that 4th of July rolled around again, and I found myself reflecting on the year that had passed. A year ago, I had lit a candle on my balcony and watched fireworks from a distance, alone in my own peace. But that night, I didn't feel lonely. I felt content, at peace with the decisions I had made and the life I had begun to rebuild. This year, I wasn't watching fireworks from the comfort of a hotel room. I wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. This year, I was free. I lit another candle that night, setting it gently on the table outside, and sat in the quiet of my balcony once again. The night air was cool, and the scent of the ocean was calming. I sipped my tea, feeling the weight of the past year settle into the background, where it belonged. "Freedom is when you no longer listen to toasts," I wrote in my diary that night, adding a few more lines to the page. "You just live." And for the first time in years, I truly understood what it meant. The months after that July 4th felt like an unspoken promise fulfilled. My days had no agenda, no meetings to attend, no forced smiles to wear. It was a quiet rebellion against the life I had led for so long. I hadn't realized just how much of myself I had given up until it was all gone. The mornings became mine. I took up gardening, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. I could smell the flowers blooming without rushing, spend hours in the sun without anyone needing anything from me. It was an awakening, as simple and as profound as that. Paul, for all his bluster, had never been a man of simple things. He had built his empire on appearances, on grand gestures. But I had learned that the true value of life was found in the moments that no one else could see. In the solitude of my mornings, I found peace. I kept my distance from the community, not because I was afraid of being scrutinized, but because I didn't need to be part of the spectacle anymore. I saw the occasional person I used to know at the grocery store or passing by my old neighborhood, and they would give me that polite, half-hearted nod. I knew they had their opinions of me. They thought I was weak for staying so long. They thought I was bitter for exposing Paul's lies, but I didn't care. I wasn't here for their approval. I was here to live on my terms. One afternoon, a few months after everything had settled, I decided to take a short trip. I drove to a nearby town by the coast. It was a quaint little place, far from the noise and politics of the city. I rented a small cottage near the water, just for a few days. I wanted to remember what it was like to be in a place where no one knew my name, where no one had any expectations of me. The first night I was there, I stood by the window and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The sky streaked with shades of purple and gold. The air was salty, refreshing. As I watched the waves crash against the shore, something stirred inside me. A feeling I hadn't had in a long time. Freedom. True freedom. Not the kind of freedom Paul had toasts for, with his speeches and applause, but the kind of freedom you earn when you finally walk away from everything you've been told to value. I spent the next few days walking along the beach, watching the fishing boats drift by, and listening to the distant chatter of the town. In many ways, I felt like a stranger there, but in other ways, I felt like I had finally come home. A few weeks later, I decided to sell the house. It wasn't a difficult decision. It had been his house, his dream, his stage. There were too many memories that lingered in the corners, too many remnants of the life I had left behind. The sale went through quickly. The agent was surprised by how eager I was to move on. I think he expected a drawn-out process, but I had no need to hold on to anything that no longer belonged to me. The house was a shell, empty of meaning. When the new owners took the keys, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel regret. I felt light. It was in the months that followed that I began to think more seriously about what I wanted. I had spent decades supporting someone else's dreams, someone else's goals. Now I had the chance to build something for myself. I enrolled in a few classes, some painting, some writing, things that I had never had the time to explore. I wasn't sure if I would be any good at them, but I didn't care. For the first time, the outcome didn't matter. It was the process, the discovery, that was important. At night, I wrote in my journal. Sometimes it was a reflection of my day. Sometimes it was just a string of thoughts I needed to release. I had always been good at keeping everything inside, but now I allowed myself to feel. The anger I had bottled up for so long had dissipated, leaving space for something else, something softer. The pain was still there, of course. The betrayal still lingered in my memory, but it wasn't the first thing I thought of when I woke up in the morning anymore. I had come to understand that healing wasn't a linear process. There were days when I still found myself grieving the life I had lost, but there were also days when I reveled in the freedom of my own company, and I was okay with that. A year passed, and the 4th of July came around again. I didn't plan anything special. I had no need for fireworks or crowds. My balcony was still my place of peace, and the candle would remain my only companion. As I stood there, watching the sky darken and the stars emerge, I realized something important. The world kept turning, regardless of who was in the spotlight. People came and went, making their grand entrances and exits, but in the end, it was the quiet moments, the ones where no one was watching, that mattered most. This year, I didn't need to toast to freedom. I had already claimed it for myself. and I was no longer waiting for permission.